Hello and welcome to the final part of the CENMAC Assistive Technology to Support Students CPD for Lambeth. So when we were talking on Thursday, we were just starting to look at some of the free apps that can be used to support children with their writing. The previous session we did was focusing mainly on reading and on phonics, and this one we're looking much more closely at writing. So we're looking at some apps now that would be able to be used to help children that are in the early stages of writing or who have difficulties with literacy in general. So some of the ones that we were looking at were these. There's lots of other ones, but we'll just have a little quick look. And the reason I chose these was because they use gamification, which we know that children like, to just practice spelling and to do the same spellings over and over again, but in different ways, which then embeds that spelling without the children getting too bored. So this first one I particularly like because it contains lots of different activities and can be used for all the different year groups. It goes all the way down to year 13, so it's got some very tricky and quite technical language in there and lots of different games and activities. So I particularly like that first one there, the spooky spellings. It gives words that are listed in the national curriculum, so we can just keep practicing those over again, but it's quite good fun. It looks nice and the children are quite engaged with it. Another one that I quite like is this one, because one of the ways that we teach children to learn their spellings is by using look, cover, write, spell, check. And this is a way of doing that, but in a slightly more interesting and engaging way. So if I just show you very quickly, if we look at year one, and I'll just go with numbers for now. So it gives you the lists of words. So you teach the lists of words in the same way that you always teach lists of words. And because it's based on the national curriculum, these will be words that you've been working on in class already. So it will just mirror what's happening in the classroom curriculum. And then once they've learnt them, you can start to play the game where it shows them the word, asks them to look at it and remember it and practice it, say it out loud, and then they're asked to spell it and it will give them instant feedback whether they've got it right or not. So that's quite nice for children because they can see what they're doing and they can see very quickly whether or not they've understood the words. This second one, Star Spell, is another one that I really like because it asks you to create the list. There's lots of lists already, so you can choose from a list that's already there, but you can also create your own lists where you can put in the words that the children are specifically working on at that moment in time in the term. So it's quite a nice way of just making this look like what they're doing in the classroom and mirroring the curriculum. The other one that I really like, they find this sort of thing really good fun. This one, unfortunately, maybe not quite so much fun, but really important and really useful, is teaching correct pronunciation. And it gives them lots of simple sentences, quite long sentences, all the way down to some very basic phrases. And it asks the children to put in their capitalization and then it explains to them and gives them hints if they've not managed to get it right. So again, lots of repetition, but quite engaging. The one thing I would say is that this one, and along with quite a lot of the other free tools that you'll find, are made in America, and so they use American spelling, like the Z in capitalization, or the fact that they say period instead of full stop. You probably want to just explain that to the children before they start so they know what they're doing. So these are just a few of the ones that I've been using, and children I know really enjoy these. If you do a search on Google for apps for writing, I'm sure you'll find plenty of other free ones or some that you can use and they'll be free for a certain amount of time. So for each student, you can set up a different account. If you do find any really good ones that you really like, please do send them through to me because then I can share them with others. And I will be sharing this PowerPoint with you, so you will be able to have access to these links at any time. So those are some really nice little apps to just get children working on individual words and spellings. However, one of the things that I also would really advocate is teaching children to touch type, or at least starting to touch type. What do we mean by that? Well, that's where they can type their language without having to seek and search for every single letter whilst doing so. Now, why is that useful? Well, because when you teach children to touch type, they develop something called muscle memory. It's like what we do when we're typing. We automatically know, without really thinking about it, that the A is over on the left-hand side or that the E is along that top line. And that's because we've been doing it so much. We may not touch type, but we've started to remember some of the places where the letters are. Why that is useful is because it then means that their typing becomes automatic. They're not having to think about their looking for their letters and using their working memory to constantly try and seek and search. They can then use that memory for spelling and organising their ideas. One of the things we see is children doing what I call the search and peck technique, where they're looking for every single letter and then using one finger to just peck at the keyboard. Apart from the fact that this takes ages, it's also actually quite difficult because they're not then starting to see those letters form the words and they're not building on their spelling skills. And it's also actually, after a while, gets quite painful on the hand because you're holding your hand in a particular way. So by teaching them some touch typing skills, you're helping them to build the speed and the fluency of which they can get their ideas written down on paper. And we know that this is one of the things that causes children to become very distracted and very frustrated. And particularly if you're looking at children who have got ADHD or autism, these are the reasons why they then begin to play up, act out, and cause difficulties in behaviour in the classroom. So touch typing, very useful skill. And those motor patterns, the fact that they're doing those repetitive actions that support that muscle memory, then reduce the load on their thinking skills. And that's what makes writing so exhausting. Now, one of the ones that I really like is Doorway Online. It's completely free. There are lots of others. I've seen children using typing.com. That's great for littler kids, looks very pretty, does have adverts popping up, so that can be a bit distracting. There's TTS, there's CAS typing, there's lots of other different ones. But this one I really like, and I particularly like the fact that it also has a voice built into it, so it talks children through, because then it becomes accessible for children with visual impairment as well. And what this is showing you is that you start by putting your fingers in the right places on the keyboard, and it then talks you through where you are going to be having to type.
The left-hand home keys are S, D, F,
A.
So it tells you what finger you should be using, it tells you where to find the key on the screen, and it also tells you what order you're having to put those words in, and it repeats over and over again. It's not the most exciting thing, but you're learning to touch type as you go. What we recommend with this is that you give children 5 or 10 minutes at a time, 3 or 4 times a week, so that they're just regularly repeating the same skills over and over again. Trying to get children to do an hour of this will just turn them off and is not going to be very beneficial. The other thing that I would say is that sometimes children don't ever learn to touch type fully. What they do is they roughly learn where the letters are and roughly space their hands out in the right position. That's absolutely fine. What I always say is if we're teaching the children to type efficiently, that's more important than trying to get them to type perfectly. So touch typing, really useful skill, especially as the kids get older, but when they're very little, it's a nice way of starting them off. And it also means that what they have on their paper doesn't have errors, doesn't have mistakes, and stops that scrubbing things out and wanting to start over and over again. But what about children who just find even typing too slow and they get very distracted? Well, for those sort of children, why not try using voice to text? So we were looking in the very last section on touch typing and talking about why touch typing can be really good to support children with literacy, specifically those that have sensory issues. However, what happens when you have some students who can't even do that, who genuinely don't have the wherewithal to begin typing at all. So this can be for a lot of different reasons. This could be for literacy reasons because their spelling is so poor, their sentence construction is so poor that they genuinely are unable to form sentences, whether they are writing them or typing them. But it could also be something more than that. It could be a sensory issue. You will sometimes find that children with autism have real issues with touch and certain textures, and they find writing, holding a pen and writing on paper, and the noise that that makes and the feel that that gives them, but also touching a keyboard and feeling their way on the keys, that can sometimes be quite disruptive to them. You may well also find that there'll be some students who have dyslexia, who have lots of ideas of things they want to say, but are just not able to write any of them down. And they then find themselves trapped. They have so many ideas in their head and they just can't express them. That then leads to them becoming disgruntled and upset in lessons. That will often lead to them having behavioural issues. And so you can see how all of these things have a knock-on effect. So one of the things that you can do for that is to use voice to text. And by that, I mean dictation. Now, there's a lot of dictation software that you can pay for. Things that you may have heard of, for example, are things like Dragon. That's probably the most well-known one. But I just wanted to show you how you can actually use dictation within Microsoft 365. There's a lot of very good free dictation software available. So in Microsoft 365, you can use this within any Word box. Here you can see I am just going to type straight in to the PowerPoint that I have in front of me. Full stop. New line. You can also open a Word document and you can see just at the top of this PowerPoint, there is a little icon here. You can use that too. If that appears, then you can use that in exactly the same way. Just click on there. But not always does that appear. So I'm going to show you how you can use dictation in absolutely anything. You can use it to type into an email, for example. You can type into an online screen. You can type into an exam paper. And I'll show you how to do that in just a moment. Full stop. Just remember to turn off your microphone, because it literally will write down everything that it hears. Now, if you look at that, you can see that, okay, there are one or two errors, and that's probably down to my accent. That could be down to somebody's speech defect. It could just be down to a disruption in the room. There are other things, there are other tools that you can have alongside voice to text, which you will train the voice to text to recognize your accent, and those are used specifically for children, for example, with cerebral palsy, who have disturbed speech or who have verbal dyspraxia, who find it very difficult to pronounce words correctly. So as I said, if you're using Microsoft, so if you're a Microsoft school and you're using Microsoft 365, the buttons that I used was the Windows key on my keypad. It's at the bottom left. It looks like a little window, plus H. So it's Windows plus H. That will open up the microphone if you're working on something that doesn't have the little microphone icon in the top. However, if you're a Google school, you have to do something slightly different, but you can still use Google typing. So I haven't got the tools button on mine because I'm working on Microsoft, but if you were on a Google doc, you would see at the top on the left-hand side, one of the drop-down menus would say Tools, and that would bring down a menu, and just by scrolling down, you then click on Voice Typing. That opens up the microphone in exactly the same way, and away you go. And you can type in exactly the same way. You will have noticed that I was telling my voice typing to put full stops in. You can also change that so that you don't have any punctuation, so that forces your student to go back in and add their own punctuation, for example, or you can have it so that you can put all punctuation in, commas, exclamation marks. You can adapt that very quickly. So that's Google voice typing. So we've looked at just typing, we've looked at voice typing. But then what happens if you have students who are right at the start of their learning journey for when it comes to writing? There will be some who are just emerging writers and have very emerging literacy needs. So one of the things that CENMAC can provide here is this really powerful piece of software called Clicker. Now, Clicker is one of these pieces that CENMAC provides that comes at a cost. The school, if you're a CENMAC school, the school doesn't pay anything towards that. But we can provide it because we have so many users that we use a multi-user license, and it works out much cheaper for us. For a school to buy it as a one-off, it can be quite expensive. The other thing is, if you, after seeing this, you think, actually, I can think of a lot of students that this would really benefit in our school, you could perhaps consider getting a multi-user license so everyone can benefit in the school. Or if you can just think of a few, then perhaps consider making a referral, and I'll show you how to do that a bit later on. Make a referral to CENMAC, and so those students can have Clicker made available to them. So let me show you how Clicker works. So Clicker is basically a tool that allows word processing, but with a lot of built-in support. One of the examples I'm going to show you here is something called a sentence set. So this is for children who are right at the very early stages of writing, and I literally want to teach them to write a sentence, to build on the sentence structure, but I don't want them to struggle with the spelling and having to think about how to write the words themselves and how to type them. So I've put this sentence in, David likes to play football, and you can see there the words underneath that the student can choose from. And I could, if the student really needed it, I could put them in the correct order. I've put them in a random order. And so then I would literally just touch the word on the touch screen or use the mouse, and it would add the words into the sheet. So I'm writing, David likes to play football. You can see I've accidentally pressed too many times, and so I can just delete that. But this is by touching that word, this is copy typing, and the pupil can see the word, can then see the sentence, and then when I add a full stop on the end, it will read that out to me aloud. So I'm building on the child's sentence structure, on their spelling techniques, on their sound to spelling relationship. But I've really supported that very, very heavily by giving them the phrase to copy. So now I'm building from that, the slightly more complicated. I'm taking away a little bit of that scaffolding. I want them now to write the next sentence, which is a little bit longer. You can see there I've given them the keywords still, but I haven't given them the sentence to copy. You can see there's a little eyeball icon just there on the left-hand side. And if I press on that, that allows me to see that sentence. But you can see there that once they see the sentence, the words are grayed out, so they can't just copy those in. What I'm going to need the student to do here is to read with me or to listen to me read with them, to actually engage with that sentence, to look at it, to repeat it, to memorize it. And then by removing the words, I can then get them to start in the same way as I did before, clicking on the individual words at the bottom to build that sentence. If I get to a certain point and I forget, maybe I can't remember what came next, I can then click on the eyeball again, and it gives me another chance to have a look at that sentence, and I can read that with them. So they're really engaging with that sentence and starting to build on their literacy skills. And then I can remove the sentence again and carry on by literally touching the words on the screen or using the mouse to touch them, and it will add them. And then again, when I put the full stop on the end, it will read the whole sentence out loud to me so that I can absolutely clarify what I've done and build on my sound spelling relationships again. taking it a step further again now. I don't want them to actually see this sentence before they've actually written it. So with this one, it's a slightly more complex sentence. It's still building on the previous ones. And you can see there on the left-hand side now, there's a little speaker. By clicking on there, the student can listen to the sentence that I want him to say, and he can listen to it as many times as he wants, but he can't actually see it. Having listened to it, he can then start touching on the screen the words in the correct order. So this time it was David does not like to play football with his dad. I'm building on the previous one. I'm just turning it into a negative sentence. And he can listen to that as many times as he wants, but once he's listening, he can't actually touch. He can only start touching once the listening has stopped. So it's building another layer of complexity. You've given him a lot of support right at the start, lots of scaffolding, and then we're gradually taking that away. The next stage then is to ask a student to start typing their own sentences, but I don't want to take away all support. I just want them to start building those sentences on their own. Now, this could be several weeks further down the line. So for this one, I was working with a student that was doing some work on the rainforest, and he was very knowledgeable about the rainforest, but just not very good at spelling some of the key words. So by putting the keywords in this little word bank for him, I've now enabled him to build his sentences, write whatever he wants to say, and then whenever he comes across a word that he's struggling with, he can just touch it on the screen or touch it with the mouse and it will pop that word into his sentence. The other thing is that by having the words there, it's also a real memory prompt for him because this is what we were talking about in class. And so that will remind him of some of the concepts that he's been learning about to help him to start using those. So I could just start typing and then I clicked on rainforest and I didn't need to type that. So I didn't have that slowing down process where he was worrying about how to spell it. He could just touch it on there. We can see lots of, and then I wanted colourful. So he typed in, we can see lots of, and then he wanted colourful. He found it, touched it, and it popped it in. And then he decided to go for butterflies. It could have been snakes, it could have been monkeys, insects. So he went for butterflies there, and he's built that sentence. It's given him a real sense of empowerment because he's built the sentence himself. He's just had support with the words that were hard. Now, one of the things that people say is, well, how are we going to have time to put those words in? Well, I can tell you it literally takes seconds to build a new grid for a student, and it takes seconds to build those sentences. So you can actually do those in the classroom during the lesson. So while perhaps a teacher is talking at the front, having liaised with the teacher beforehand and you know what the key words are that the children are going to be learning about, you can build that word bank live in the lesson in real time. It literally will take a minute or 2 minutes and then it's there. And then you can save that word bank into his Clicker account so that next time you want him to write sentences, he's still got that word bank and you can get him to write completely different sentences. So it's actually building on his knowledge each time. The next step from that is to take away the word banks and to use these little, it's called the predictor. And it's a little bit like when you use predictive text on your phone. As I start typing, so now I probably practice those sentences a few times, using the sentence sets, perhaps using the word banks, perhaps. And now I want the student to try and write his own sentences, remembering what he's been working on. So he can start to free type. And you notice once he starts typing a word, having turned on the predictor, it's brought down a little menu and it's given me some choices of the different words that he could be trying to say. It's trying to guess and preempt what word it is that he's trying to work on. And he can listen to those words. He can right click on them and listen to those words, or he can just go ahead and choose the correct word. And by touching it on the screen or by touching it with his mouse, he can then add that word into his sentence. In the rainforest, we can see, and I've got L, and it's trying to work out, okay, lots. But it could have been lights. He can listen to the word he wants by adding an extra letter. It will narrow down the field or give him a different selection of words. So if you've looked at those and thought, well, actually, I can see some students that would really benefit, perhaps you might want to consider writing a referral for CENMAC. In the first instance, I would say have a little look at our website. This is our website. It's cenmac.com, and there's all sorts of things on there that can be really helpful before you even consider writing a referral. One of the things we offer, you can see there on the top, on the menu, is training. We do lots of free training opportunities, and these are open to people whether you are a CENMAC school or not. We run something called a Thursday 30. Now that is every single Thursday at 3:30, hence the name, and it will be on either one piece of software that we work with, or it will be on some generic tools like accessibility in Microsoft, or it can be on a specific device that we use regularly, and it'll be just 30 minutes introducing online what that can do and how it can help you. Now, we fully realise that for some people, for most people working in schools, 3:30 on a Thursday is not necessarily a good time. So by looking at that drop-down menu, you will see one of the tabs says Thursday 30 recordings. We always record all of our trainings, and that then brings you to all of the recordings of all of the trainings that we've done for the last 18 months, and you can scroll down and choose the ones that you think could be useful and watch those in your own time. There is one on there on Clicker, for example. There is definitely one on there on how to use voice typing in Microsoft, and so on. But then you might want to go on to do a referral. So again, on looking at that top menu, you can see the third one along says referrals. And just by clicking on there, it will bring you down a drop-down menu with information on how to go about making these referrals. There's slightly different referrals for different local authorities, and it's the local authority that the student lives in and not the local authority that the school is in that you would have to use. The forms are very similar, but there's very slight differences. What I would say is when you're filling in a referral form, don't think of CENMAC as just a way of providing you with a laptop, because you will be turned down. What we are there to offer is stuff that you couldn't normally get on your own. So where you could probably just get a laptop for a student out of their EHCP, you probably wouldn't be able to get access to some of the software or the training and the support for the student, for the parents, for the staff. So that's the sort of thing that you want to emphasize when you're making your referral. And then I said I was going to touch just very briefly on exams and exams accessibility, because if a student has grown up from a very young age using a laptop and using typing and using voice typing, that has become their normal way of working. It's not to say that we're not going to allow them to write. Of course, they will learn to write as well. This is always a fear, and sometimes particularly with parents, that if we allow them to use voice typing, well, they're never going to learn to write. They always are, because we're never going to stop that side of things. You're never just going to be using a laptop. However, if that's the way that you develop, and when you're writing longer pieces of text, that's what you use, then that's your normal way of producing text. And so we need to be able to enable that in an exam. Now, the current situation, and actually some of these figures are now probably out of date because they're a couple of years old, is that when you get to, this is GCSE level, a lot of students across the schools, and actually this goes right the way down to Key Stage 3 and in SATS exams actually too, lots of pupils need to have some form of additional access arrangement, be that extra time given to them or coloured paper and so on and so forth. Of that, on average, so bearing in mind this takes into account very small primary schools all the way through to very large academies, on average 40 students in each school require a reader or a scribe. That means a human that will sit next to them and read the questions for them, or a human that will sit next to them and write the answers for them, or both. That comes at a massive cost. This is an average cost to schools to provide their human readers and scribes. That is a huge amount of money. So that's one of the negatives of using human readers or scribes. However, I am a real advocate for saying that actually that's not the biggest negative disadvantage. I would say if you're using a scribe or a reader, and quite often schools have to get people in specially to do that, particularly at exam time, these people need training. So that is time consuming. That means that they have to then come in and be paid to come in and have their training, which is even more cost, or schools rely on them to do it without any training. And actually, that's doing a huge disservice to the pupils because it's not just a case of sitting there and writing what you hear. It is quite a skill to know how to do it properly. But as far as the student's concerned, it adds an increased cognitive load on their student for having an additional layer of processing, because not only are they thinking about what they need to say, they're then trying to formulate what their answer is going to be. And if you have a student who has cognitive processing issues, that's difficult in itself. They then have to tell somebody else. They then have to wait for that person to write that down. They then have to check that the person's written down what they said they wanted them to write down, whilst thinking about the next thing that they're going to write. That's a huge amount of brain work for a student who is struggling anyway with literacy. And this idea of dual modalities, that's just like a posh word really for doing two things at once. And I know as adults, we sometimes find trying to multitask really complicated. Multitasking for a child with ADHD or with autism or with dyslexia or with dyspraxia is always going to cause a much poorer performance. The other thing is that the presence of another person sitting next to them can be really distracting. If you've got a child with autism, for example, being in such close proximity to another adult is really going to increase their anxiety levels, and it's going to make it really difficult for some students to perform in an exam at all. And then the biggest disadvantage, as far as I'm concerned, is that actually what we're doing is removing a child's independence. We're hoping to make them more independent, and in fact, we're taking that independence away, because what we're asking them to do is to rely on another person to do that reading and that writing for them. And when they go through to adulthood and to college or to university, they're not going to have that scribe or reader sitting next to them to do that. So if we can give them the tools, be that hardware or software, to do those tasks independently, we're future-proofing them for later life. Even simple things like going to the shops or filling in tax forms, any of these things, if we take that independence away from them, they're never going to be able to do those things on their own. So what types of assistive technology can they use? Loads, actually. They're allowed to use computers and tablets and laptops, as long as that's part of their normal way of working and has been applied for as part of their assessment procedures. Text-to-speech programs, that means where they get the exam paper on a laptop or on a computer and they can use that to read the questions to them. Really useful for students with dyslexia, for example, or for students with autism who find concentration very difficult. But you can also have smaller pieces of technology like a scanning and reader pen, which is just like it sounds, looks like a pen that scans over the text and then reads it out aloud to the student. Now, imagine when you have somebody next to you, and I know I do this all the time, I might mishear them the first time and I'll ask them again. And then if I kind of mishear them again, I might, if I'm feeling quite brave, I might say, sorry, can you repeat that again? But then that's it. I'm not going to ask again. And in an exam, students often sort of say they've understood when they actually haven't understood. So being able to just go back over the sentence themselves as many times as they want independently massively increases their confidence and their ability. It also means they can go over individual words when they've actually got most of the sentence, but they just want to have an extra bit of repetition for a particular word. Voice to text we've just discussed already. So dictation software that we showed earlier can be used in exams as long as it's applied for as part of their access arrangements. Now, in many cases, they will lose their SPAG marks. However, if they have a scribe, they will also lose their SPAG marks. So there's no difference other than they're actually doing it for themselves. If you have students with visibility issues, they can use specific technology such as Braille writers and Braille note takers. CENMAC can provide those if they have a referral and that becomes their normal way of working. Lots of children use these already, things like coloured backgrounds and coloured overlays. That's a form of assistive technology. It's just a low-tech one, and it's something that a lot of students find very helpful when it comes to their exams, and they can have those put onto the screen so that if the screen is reading the question to them, the background is in their preferred colour so that they can follow it on the screen much more easily. And then the final one is modified equipment. If you have students with physical disabilities, you can provide different shaped keyboards, smaller keyboards for children with smaller reach, or bigger coloured keyboards for children who need those because of visibility issues. So that's, in a nutshell, lots and lots of information spread over quite a long time. As I said earlier, please do feel free to get in contact if you would like any extra advice or any extra help. And also, if you have any feedback, positive or negative, please do send that through, because obviously we're always striving to make these better. We love to hear if we think it's been useful, but if you think you'd have preferred things done in a different way, I'm happy to hear that too. So thank you for listening. Hope you all have a really enjoyable rest of your day.